When German prisoners first arrived in the United States during World War II, most of them believed they already understood the country they were about to see. Years of propaganda had painted a very specific image in their minds. According to what they had been told, America was a soft nation, obsessed with comfort and consumer goods, a place where people lacked discipline and relied on machines instead of strength. They had heard that Americans were wealthy but weak, a society that would crumble once a real war began. So when these captured soldiers stepped off transport ships onto American soil, they expected to see signs of a country struggling under the same pressure that had consumed Europe. What they encountered instead would slowly force many of them to question everything they thought they knew about the war. The journey across the Atlantic had already begun to raise questions. Prisoners expected the crossing to be brutal, but instead they were transported under strict yet orderly conditions. They received medical attention, regular meals, and basic care that some had not experienced in months of combat. At first, many assumed this was temporary, perhaps an effort to maintain international appearances. But when the ships reached American harbors, something immediately caught their attention. The ports were enormous. Cranes moved cargo continuously, trains arrived and departed without pause, and ships loaded supplies at a speed that felt almost mechanical. Everything seemed organized with a level of efficiency that felt unfamiliar. The war had not slowed the movement of goods here. If anything, the activity seemed even more intense. From the docks, the prisoners were placed onto trains that would carry them across the country toward POW camps. The journey lasted days, sometimes longer, and during that time many prisoners stared through the windows, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The American landscape rolled past endlessly. Vast farmland stretched toward the horizon. Small towns appeared intact, with homes standing quietly beside roads where civilian cars still traveled freely. There were no bombed buildings, no shattered rail stations, no craters from air raids. For soldiers who had left behind cities darkened by blackout curtains and streets scarred by bombing, the absence of destruction was deeply unsettling. It felt as if they had arrived in a different world entirely. The trains eventually reached camps scattered across the United States. More than 400 POW camps would operate during the war, housing hundreds of thousands of captured Axis soldiers. These camps were secure and carefully monitored, surrounded by fences and guarded by American soldiers, but they were not the harsh prisons many prisoners had imagined. Barracks were organized neatly. Kitchens prepared regular meals. Medical facilities treated illness and injury. The conditions were controlled and disciplined, yet they did not match the brutal expectations many prisoners had carried with them across the ocean. Some prisoners assumed this was merely a temporary stage before harsher treatment began. Others began quietly wondering if the reality of the United States might be very different from what they had been told. Soon, the prisoners were assigned to work programs, with millions of American men fighting overseas. Farms and industries across the country faced serious labor shortages. Rather than leave crops unharvested, the United States government allowed POWs to assist under supervision. For many prisoners, this assignment would become the moment when their understanding of the war began to change in ways they had never anticipated. The first time many German soldiers stepped onto American farmland, they were stunned by its scale. The fields seemed endless, stretching far beyond what most European farms could match. Even more surprising were the machines. Massive tractors and harvesters replaced entire teams of workers. A single farmer with modern equipment could accomplish what once required dozens of laborers. Prisoners who had grown up around small farms in Germany watched these machines move across fields with mechanical precision, gathering crops faster than they believed possible. Food production here did not appear strained by war. In fact, it seemed to operate with an efficiency that suggested abundance rather than scarcity. During breaks in the workday, prisoners began noticing other details that seemed even harder to explain. American farmers still had access to fuel for their machines. Supplies arrived regularly. Trucks carried harvested crops to distribution centers without interruption. Some prisoners even noticed something else that seemed almost unbelievable during wartime. The farmers themselves appeared calm. They spoke about the war with concern for loved ones fighting overseas, but their daily lives continued with a sense of stability that felt completely foreign to soldiers who had come from bombed cities and ration lines. And this is where something interesting began to happen inside the camps. At night, prisoners talked. They compared what they had seen that day. Some insisted it had to be staged, that Americans were simply hiding their real difficulties. Others disagreed. Too many details seemed genuine. The farms were real. The machines were real. The endless fields were real. Slowly, the conversations began shifting from skepticism to curiosity. But the farms were only the beginning. In some areas, POW labor crews worked near rail yards and industrial centers connected to the war effort. It was there that many prisoners saw something that changed their understanding of the conflict entirely. American factories were operating around the clock. Workers moved through assembly lines producing engines, vehicles, and aircraft components with astonishing speed. Large buildings housed entire bomber assembly operations where aircraft took shape piece by piece as they moved down production lines. The scale of these operations was difficult to comprehend. Some prisoners had worked in factories back home, yet what they saw here seemed different. The pace was faster, the organization more refined. The flow of materials never seemed to stop. Even the transportation system reinforced this impression. Freight trains carried supplies across the country continuously. Oil, steel, food, and machinery traveled from farms and factories toward ports where ships waited to deliver them overseas. The American war effort was not just about soldiers on battlefields. It was about a network of production and logistics, that stretched across an entire continent. But perhaps the moment that shocked many prisoners the most came during something completely ordinary. A visit to an American store. Occasionally, supervised work crews passed through small towns while traveling between assignments. In those towns, prisoners sometimes saw grocery stores. What they noticed inside those stores left many of them silent. Shelves still held food, bread, canned goods, vegetables, and meat were available despite wartime rationing. Families shopped normally. Children stood beside their parents, choosing items from stocked shelves. For soldiers who remembered shortages growing worse in Germany each year of the war, the sight was almost impossible to reconcile with the idea that the United States was fully engaged in a global conflict. If you find this kind of story fascinating, it's worth paying attention to what happens next. Because the realization that followed these observations would spread quietly through POW camps across the country. Inside the barracks, prisoners began discussing what they had witnessed. Some still believed Germany could recover from the setbacks it faced in Europe. Others were no longer so sure. They had seen the farms producing enormous amounts of food. They had seen the factories building machines without pause. They had seen transportation networks moving supplies faster than any system they had known before the war. Slowly, a new understanding began forming among many of them. The United States was not simply fighting the war, it was producing it. And once that idea took hold, it became difficult to ignore the implications. Wars are often decided by strategy, leadership, and courage on the battlefield, but they are also decided by the ability to sustain those battles over time. The side that can replace lost equipment faster, feed its soldiers more reliably, and transport supplies more efficiently holds an advantage that grows stronger with each passing month. By the later years of the war, this realization had become almost unavoidable for many prisoners held in American camps. News from Europe filtered through newspapers and radio reports. Germany faced increasing shortages. Cities were bombed repeatedly. Production slowed as factories were damaged and resources grew scarce. Meanwhile, the country holding them prisoner continued producing ships, aircraft, vehicles, and supplies at a pace that seemed impossible to match. And if you think about it, that realization is exactly what made America's war effort so powerful. The battles in Europe and the Pacific were critical, but behind those battles stood something even larger, a continent-sized industrial system capable of supporting them indefinitely. By the time Germany surrendered in 1945, many of the prisoners who had spent the war years inside American camps had already reached the same quiet conclusion. The outcome of the war had not been determined by a single battle or a single decision. It had been shaped by something far broader. The farms that never stopped producing, the factories that never stopped building, the supply lines that never stopped moving. And a nation whose distance from the destruction of war allowed it to mobilize resources on a scale that few enemies had fully understood. For many German POWs, the realization came slowly but unmistakably. America wasn't just fighting the war, it was fighting a completely different kind of war. And by the time the world understood what that meant, the outcome was already becoming inevitable. If you've made it this far, you've now seen the same realization those prisoners slowly discovered. And it raises an interesting question that historians still debate today. Was the war decided on the battlefield or in the factories and farms thousands of miles away from it? Because for many of the men who saw it with their own eyes, the answer was already clear. As weeks passed, the routine inside the camps began to feel strangely predictable. Work crews left early in the morning, returned by late afternoon, and spent the evenings talking quietly inside their barracks. Yet something subtle was happening during those conversations. At first, the discussions revolved around the war itself, battles, rumors from the front, speculation about Germany's chances. But gradually, the topic shifted towards something else entirely. The prisoners began talking about America. It wasn't the soldiers guarding the camps that interested them the most. It wasn't even the camps themselves. What fascinated them were the small things they kept noticing outside the fences, the trucks that never seemed to stop moving along the roads, the trains that passed by day and night carrying cargo in both directions. The fact that farms, factories, and towns all appeared to be functioning at the same time without visible strain. In Europe, the war had reshaped daily life in ways that were impossible to ignore. Cities had grown quieter, darker, and more cautious. Supplies arrived irregularly, and entire regions had begun adapting to shortages. Even when factories continued operating, they often did so under the constant threat of air raids. In contrast, what these prisoners were witnessing in America felt like a completely different rhythm. One former prisoner would later describe it in surprisingly simple terms. He said that in Germany, the war felt like a struggle to keep things going. In America, the war looked like an expansion. Everywhere they looked, something was being built. Roads were being widened, factories were growing larger, rail yards seemed to be expanding with additional tracks and equipment. Even the farms were adapting, introducing new machines and systems designed to increase production. It became increasingly difficult for prisoners to imagine how any nation could keep up with such momentum. At first, some prisoners dismissed these observations as temporary. They believed the United States must eventually feel the same strain that Germany had experienced after years of conflict. But as the months passed, nothing seemed to slow down. The same trucks continued moving along the roads. The same trains continued passing by the camps. The same factories continued operating long after sunset. It was around this time that another realization began spreading among the prisoners. America's distance from the battlefield was not just a geographic advantage, it was an economic one. The country itself remained untouched by the destruction that had devastated much of Europe. Farms could continue producing food without interruption. Factories could expand instead of relocating underground. Transportation networks could grow stronger rather than struggling to recover from bombing damage. In other words, the American war effort was building momentum while others were losing it. This idea became difficult to ignore once the prisoners began comparing what they had seen with the news arriving from Europe. Reports of bombings in German cities grew more frequent. Stories of shortages became harder to deny. Some prisoners even began receiving letters describing how daily life back home had grown increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, the world outside the camps in America seemed almost unchanged. Stores continued operating, roads remained busy, trains moved supplies across the country with remarkable consistency. The war was clearly present. Posters encouraged civilians to buy war bonds, and military convoys occasionally passed along highways. But the sense of collapse that had begun appearing in Europe simply did not exist here. This contrast created a strange psychological effect among the prisoners. Some of them began to wonder whether Germany's leaders had misunderstood the scale of the country they were fighting. Before the war, many German strategists believed that American society was too divided, too focused on comfort, and too dependent on consumer culture to sustain a long global conflict. The assumption was that once casualties mounted and production demands increased, the American public would grow tired of the war. Yet, what the prisoners were seeing suggested something very different. The country had not slowed down. If anything, it appeared to be accelerating. Factories expanded production lines, farms increased yields, shipyards launched new vessels at a pace that surprised even American observers. By the time Allied forces began pushing deeper into Europe, American industry had already produced staggering numbers of aircraft, vehicles, and ships. For the prisoners who had spent months watching the system operate from the outside, the pattern had become obvious. America was not merely responding to the war, it was overwhelming it. And once that realization took hold, many prisoners began to see the conflict from an entirely new perspective. Victory was not just about strategy or bravery, it was about capacity, the ability to replace losses faster than they occurred, the ability to feed soldiers, transport equipment, and sustain operations across oceans without interruption. Those advantages were not always visible on the battlefield itself, but they were visible in the farms, factories, and rail yards that these prisoners had seen every day. By the time the war finally ended in 1945, many of them had already reached a quiet conclusion. The United States had not simply fought the war more effectively, it had fought the war with a system that made long-term defeat almost impossible. And for the German soldiers who had watched that system operating from inside prisoner camps across the country, the lesson was clear. America had not just been fighting World War II, it had been building the conditions that made victory inevitable.